China ends most zero COVID rules, and Iran might be abolishing its morality police. News broke in the past week. On Wednesday, China's health authorities overhauled its zero COVID policy and announced a 10-point national plan that scrapped most health code tracking. And also, they're rolling back their mass testing. And this allowed many positive cases to just simply quarantine at home like we were doing, I guess, a year ago now. And they're limiting some of these lockdowns. This all comes from a Foxconn letter, which we don't know the causation here.
Does it?
Chamath?
Does
well,
it?
we don't know. That's why I just said we don't know cause and correlation here. Give us some perspective here, Chamath.
Well, I just think it's kind of ridiculous to assume that the second largest economy in the world pivots based on one letter from one CEO. So I know that that's how the Western
Describe
media...
the letter, please. Yep.
Well, apparently what happened was Terry Guo, who's colloquially known as Uncle Terry, who's the CEO of Foxconn, wrote a letter that essentially said, if we don't figure out a way to get out of this lockdown process, we're going to lose, our leadership in the global supply chain. And apparently that jolted the Central Planning Commission to realize that they needed to, get out of these lockdowns. I think it's something different, which is I think this has been part and parcel of a very focused and dedicated plan by Xi. Phase 1 was to consolidate power. Phase 2 was to get through November and to basically get reappointed for life and dispel any other, rivals that he actually had. And now phase 3 is just to reopen the economy again so this guy can basically sit on top of the second largest economy in the world. So I think this is sort of a natural flow of things. The other part of it, which I think is being underreported, is I think that the way in which they did it was less responsive, in my opinion, to a letter from Uncle Terry, but was more responsive to the fact that there are people on the ground. And I think that these guys are getting very sophisticated in understanding how to give the Chinese people some part of what they want so that they're roughly happy enough to keep moving forward. And I'm not going to morally judge whether it's right or wrong, but it's just a comment on what the gameplay and the game theory seems to be coming from the leadership of China. So I think it's good for the Chinese people. And the real question is, what will it mean for the U.S. economy if these guys get their economy going again?
We talked about this previously, but this is a good example of the autocrat not necessarily being absolute in their authority. And the sense that I think we get at this point coming out of China is that there was enough dissent from the populace on the lockdown and the experience of the lockdowns. And we can all go online and see the videos of steel bars being put on doors to keep people in their apartment buildings and people screaming and buildings being on fire. People can't escape the buildings. How much of that was true or not? And riots in the street and people fighting with the COVID testers. How much of it is true or not, we don't really know. But it certainly seems to indicate that there was enough dissent and enough unrest that in order to stay in power, the CCP had to take action and they had to shift their position and shift their tone. And I think it's a really important moment to observe that sometimes the CCP, perhaps even we can extend this into other autocratic regimes that we think are absolute in their authority and their power, perhaps are necessarily influenced by the people that they are there to govern and that they are, ruling over. And that while we don't think about these places as democracies, perhaps they're not entirely the traditionally defined autocracy, that there is an influence that the people can have. And maybe we see the same change happening in Iran with young people and a population that's more modern, that's growing and swelling in size, that doesn't want to accept some of the traditional norms and the traditional laws. And, maybe that will kind of start to resonate around the world, that the internet is starting to do what everyone hoped and wanted it to do, which is the democratization of information, the democratization of seeing other people's conditions and seeing what the rest of the world is and is like, gives the populace the ability to rise up and to say, this is what we want, because we know that there are better things out there. And these autocratic regimes have to start to shift slightly. And over time, maybe that has a real impact.
Here's a specific statistic and chart for everybody. The demographics of Iran are incredibly notable. If you look at this chart, for those of you listening, it just shows people by age and what percentage of the population they are, or actually the raw numbers of the population. As you can see, it's basically like a pear. You have very few old people, and you have a lot of people in their 20s and younger. And so young people...
No, Jason, it's really 40s and 30s is really...
Yeah, okay, so 40s, 30s. You don't have the geriatric population that you see in other countries like Japan. And so the demographics of Iran are extremely weighted towards younger people, millennials, Gen Xers, and younger. And they have VPNs, virtual private networks. They can see everything happening in the free world versus, let's say, closed societies. And so I think that's what gives me a lot of hope, is that these countries are going to have to evolve because young people are seeing how the rest of the world lives. And I think that's a big part of the change. Chamath, what are your thoughts?
About Iran specifically?
I think demographic change, and then China and demographic change protests.
I've said this before, and I've been tweeting about this for years, but people so poorly understand demographics. Everybody thinks that we have a surplus of people, and we don't. And we need to have a positive birth rate in order to kind of continue to support the expansion of the world and GDP. And we need that. And right now, we're not in that situation. If you look at a country by country basis, a lot of these countries are facing that in a pretty cataclysmic way. The most sensitive country to this is China. I mean, their population at current course and speed, I think the last number is it's going to halve by 2100. There'll be about 600 million people in China, which is unbelievably disruptive in a very negative way for them, right? Because you will have a lot of people who are entering the workforce having to support an entire cohort of people above them in terms of age, right? Who are retired, et cetera. So the state's going to have to get much, much more actively involved over the next 50 years in China. And then you look at other countries like Nigeria or India, who are in, at the beginning of what could be a multi-decade boom, because you have 20-year-olds that will be entering the workforce. They'll effectively work for less than their older counterparts, right? So then there'll be an incentive then to bring work onshore into those countries. And so it's going to have huge impacts, because then you have rising GDP, you'll have rising expectations of living quality, you'll have rising expectations of how governments treat those people. So it's all kind of positive in general, but the world needs more people. Let's just be clear, especially in Western countries. We're not as badly off as China, but we're not far behind.
Yeah, here's a quick view of China and Japan. Just these same kind of, I don't know what they exactly call these charts, are kind of like vertical histograms, but you start, and again, data is hard to come by in some countries, but China's starting to get top heavy when compared to Iran. And then if you look at Japan, quite stunning. There's just no young people left, and they live to much older ages in Japan. Its longevity is one of their great strengths as a population, as a country, and so these demographics can't be fought. You're going to have a constricting economy in Japan, and their place in the world is going to be very, very different. Okay, where do we want to go to next?
You never asked my opinion on these protests in China.
Usually you just talk, so go ahead. I didn't know if I could throw to you.
No, I usually have to fight to give my opinion.
Oh, here we go. Listen, have your agent call my agent. We'll talk about it. Okay, we'll talk about it on the all-in yearly dinner.
I have a slightly different view of what's happening in China, Jason, which is, I think that the people there need to stop harassing the CCP. You see, the Chinese Communist Party, they're the elites. They've set things up for the benefit of the people. They're not engaged in shadow banning. They're just, they have a system there to engage in censorship, to prevent abuse and harm.
Yeah.
Right? That's the system they've set up, right?
Yep.
And the people just need to understand that when they say things like, when they oppose things like COVID lockdowns, like Jay Bhattacharya did, they need to understand that is engaging in abuse and harm.
Exactly.
See?
Yes. And you know what? They've provided re-education camps for citizens who need, to maybe rethink their positions on freedom and their wages, the hours they work, and their social conditions. You're absolutely correct. China really has built a perfect model for our society. Well said, Sachs.
Great. Now we can move forward. Let's go.
Now we can move forward. We're in agreement.
Sachs, by the way, you know that's going to get clipped out and go viral.
Well,
it's all good.
you understand, right?
No, it's a good bit.
According to our elites,
Some
like
elites,
Yoel Roth or Taylor Lorenz, to criticize them is a form of harassment. You understand that, right? So, therefore, what the people in China are doing, specifically by opposing lockdowns, they're taking the Jay Bhattacharya point of view. They're engaging in harm and abuse and harassment of their betters, of their elites.
The disagreement.
Why won't they just submit to the social credit system that has been set up for them for their benefit?
It's for their benefit. Why question it? Yeah, just accept your fate and work hard for the good of the people.
Great points. Let's move forward.